Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Olsson. I am the creative director here at Reimagine 2020. Thank you for tuning in to another Reimagine 2020 virtual event. We are on our fourth event. This one is themed Tales from the Crypto. Here in the States, we are playing off of the season of Halloween, and we want to hear some of the spookiest and scariest stories from those people who are building within the cryptocurrency and blockchain space. Joining me today is Terry Culver. He is CEO of ETC Labs. Terry, how are you? Where are you in the world today?
Great, thanks. I'm in New York City.
New York City. How are things over in New York City?
They are good. Life isn't completely back to normal, but people are being responsible for the most part, and it's okay.
Got it. Yeah. I was here in Minneapolis once things were getting really bad, and if the quarantine wasn't enough, right, it was riots on top of that. So I'm glad to hear that even in places like New York City, right, especially now, despite the fact that they're maybe not desirable conditions, they can be habitable in their own way. So um, Terry, we're going to get into a little bit of a conversation here about kind of what ETC Labs is up to, and um, sort of I want to hear a little bit about your philosophy on the space overall. But to stick with tradition, um, here at Reimagine, we want to give an emphasis to education, right? Before we hit record, you and I were talking a little bit about always having in mind people like grandma and mom and dad and the likes, people that you might encounter at the dinner table, if you will. And those people are relevant to keep in mind when discussing cryptocurrencies and the revolution of digital currencies and kind of how blockchain technology is going to revolutionize the financial infrastructures of the future, such that we would hope everyone can, enjoy a more free and open society. And to sort of stick to that um, emphasis, we like to hear a little bit of testimony of everybody that we get to speak to, right? How did X, Y, and Z come into the space? So Terry, let me ask you, how did you come into the world of blockchain and cryptocurrencies?
Pure accident, I, sh- I think. Um, I had been working as a policy advisor in emerging markets and developing countries, mostly economic policy and technology policy to promote health and well-being and economic development. And in the course of that work, you come across all kinds of challenges, weak institutions, large sectors of the informal economy, people who are excluded from the financial system. And I started hearing about blockchain and thought, well, let me look into that. And it seemed to me that here's a technology that might actually help address some of those fundamental challenges you have in large parts of the world. And so that's when I started getting involved. And about 3 years ago, I moved from being associate dean at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs to ETC Labs to pursue that full time.
Well, that like it's interesting to hear that because some of us over here at MouseBelt, we have an academic background. Myself, I'm still a PhD student. I'm studying for a degree in philosophy. As much as that seems like a not so promising future. So, I mean, like, what would you say it was about that aspect of yourself, right, in the past that led you to become a dean within the university system that eventually merged with your interest in a technology that was presumably going to revolutionize the financial world?
It was, I think, seeing firsthand the results of foreign aid, or the lack of results of foreign aid. Seeing that in many countries, despite years of foreign aid, growth and even living standards have declined. Seeing well-intentioned projects and people working very hard who couldn't actually achieve what they wanted to achieve because of systematic issues. And it seemed to me that blockchain was a systematic change. It wasn't just providing more funding or providing more people. It's a different way of creating, storing, and transmitting value, and one that gives people a certain amount of independence. So I think in the course of my policy work, one of the things that struck me was, you have formal economies that oftentimes exclude large swaths of people. And then you have huge informal economies where people are trading, they're prosperous sometimes. There's enormous activity going on, especially in emerging markets and developing countries. And the two almost never meet. And it seemed to me that, well, blockchain was a way to actually encourage the kind of peer-to-peer transactions that you have in informal economies and make it global and make it legitimate.
So, like, would it be safe to say that you found in the concept of decentralization a sort of safe haven for underrepresented groups throughout the world, whether that be those who didn't have access to banking, which of course would give them access to lending and borrowing, etc. Was it that the notion of decentralization sort of inherent to a blockchain? Was it that I guess perked your interest, or if not, what else was it?
Yeah, I mean, it started with the realization that centralization works for only a few. And leading from there, identifying, I think, the two crucial aspects of blockchain. One is, as you mentioned, decentralization, and the other is censorship resistance. That there's no single authority that it can exclude someone or their transactions from the network. That it's permissionless. It's available to everyone.
Yeah. So then what was your first, I mean, like that kind of explains your sort of disposition, right? To kind of like to be drawn toward this space. But more concretely, what was your first kind of interaction with, let's say, Bitcoin, if it was Bitcoin, or Ethereum, which, we'll eventually get to that. But what sort of concretely was the first engagement that you had with anything within this space?
It was a paper that I came across talking about how Bitcoin adoption was higher in countries with high inflation rates, that there's a correlation between high inflation and Bitcoin adoption. And I thought, that's interesting. And so that was really my introduction. And so I started learning about the technology from there. I got connected to several people who were active in the ecosystem. They were developing, they were investing, and they were experimenting. And out of those introductions, James Wu and I established Ethereum Classic Labs.
Yeah, that's one thing actually that I have been trying to communicate with my peers lately, is that the of utmost importance, in my opinion, for one's political, thoughts and considerations today is what we're doing with this stimulus, right? And kind of like what happens with increased rates of inflation over time, especially when people's income isn't adjusted to keep up with that, right? Saying like, hey, I don't care who you vote for, but you need to keep in mind that money is something that should be on your radar, just as much as the person that you think is representing all of your ideals. But that's a different story. Anyways, this is just to kind of pay homage to some of the things that I was hearing you talk about, and terms of what got you interested here. So you had mentioned at the end there, when you came upon ETC Labs. Maybe before we get into sort of what ETC Labs is and what it's doing, you can tell, maybe you can fill out a little bit more of that story about how you came to develop ETC Labs.
Sure. So I had gotten to know James Woe from Digital Finance Group, and he asked me to come on board to help launch ETC Labs. And the basic idea was, there needed to be more people devoted to public blockchain, to building it, expanding it, sustaining it. That you have groups of very talented developers who can build things. You have groups of investors who can provide capital for things. But at this early stage in the technology, you need entities in between whose primary purpose is the stewardship of the public blockchain itself. And so that's why we created Ethereum Classic Labs, to do that for the Ethereum Classic blockchain.
Yeah, so it's like in the world of an open access blockchain, right? You need people that like you need to sort of aggregate people, developers, right? In a somewhat centralized way, right? But it like at the very least under the rubric of one organization, right? That can assume, as you put it, a stewardship over the development of whatever it is that you're working with. In this case, it would be the Ethereum Classic blockchain. Yeah.
That's right. And to be clear, we're not the only one working on Ethereum Classic. We're just one of several organizations. But we felt that it was a public blockchain that was under-resourced, and where we felt we could make a positive contribution.
Mm-hmm. And how did I mean, maybe for those people who are unaware, right? Because what I'm hearing is that Ethereum Classic Labs, right, is an entity which is assuming a kind of stewardship over the development. Like at least it's one of the stewards of the development of Ethereum Classic blockchain, right? So there are two distinct items here. There is those people who are developing the blockchain, and then there is the Ethereum Classic blockchain, right? Which is distinct again from Ethereum. So maybe you could say a little bit about how the Ethereum Classic blockchain itself became a distinct entity apart from what other people might know to be the Ethereum blockchain.
Yes. So a few years ago, there was a DAO set up in Ethereum, which was meant to collect and distribute funding for developers to help build the Ethereum ecosystem. There was a vulnerability in the contract that people used to contribute funds to the DAO. Someone exploited that vulnerability and was able to take, I think, about $60 million out of that DAO. And it was a crisis, I think a significant crisis at an early stage for Ethereum. And there was a real debate about what to do in response. Do you simply accept the fact that there was a vulnerability in the contract, someone exploited it, and that's that, and move on? Or do you roll back that transaction and restore funds to the people who contributed them to kind of set things right? The community, for the most part, decided to roll back the transaction. There was another group that felt that this violated the idea of immutability on a blockchain. And so they separated and established Ethereum Classic. So technically what happened was Ethereum forked. They basically, created a new version of Ethereum, and Ethereum Classic had miners who kept producing blocks on the old chain, and then were able to get exchanges to list it, and it's still surviving today.
One thing that I was just thinking about is the way that forks in this case are a representation of a kind of democratic process, where, like, at least in proof of stake consensus mechanisms, miners can sort of cast their vote by redirecting hash power, etc. What do you think it says that the so-called Ethereum network, the sort of what we know to be today as the sort of gray diamond, if you will, what do you think it says that that reigns as the sort of champion of the Ethereum name, meaning that most people voted for that to be the, I guess, the sort of primary hair of the blockchain?
Yeah, I don't think that that decision was the primary reason why Ethereum has grown so much. I think Ethereum has grown so much because of its community and its developer talent. I think it's remarkable in both of those ways. And I think you have to give credit to where credit is due, that over a relatively short amount of time, the Ethereum community has been able to grow and expand in a tremendous way. I think, the debate itself about the DAO, I think it points to the difficulty around governance in trustless networks. To be honest, there's no right or wrong answer. I think it's really how you define immutability and what you think is best for the ecosystem. The folks in Ethereum Classic at the time felt very strongly that the community needed to take a stand about governance, about what immutability means, and that rolling back that transaction felt like a violation to them. So it was a stand on principle. It wasn't actually a stand on technology. It was about perceived values of immutability.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's an interesting point to say that it wasn't a stand on technology, right? But the way things play out is usually a stand of one's philosophy, and this is why we end up with many different chains. In the case of chains that work on proof of work, right? You have like different chains, or even in sort of more contemporary proof of stake chains that have on-chain governance, right? Whenever you have an update, right, these are not necessarily sort of visions of one's beliefs in what technology should be, right? They're usually reflections of what the community's values are, right? They're sort of reflections in code of what people's philosophies are. So maybe kind of transitioning into some more technical discussion about what ETC Labs is doing, now that we've heard a little bit about kind of how ETC Labs has come onto the scene. What's something right now that you're really excited about? What is ETC Labs doing to add new additions to the Ethereum Classic blockchain protocol?
Sure. We're actually doing a lot, both on the technical level. So we have a team working on the protocol. We're building different features like a trace API so that it's easier for exchanges and others to search large batches of transactions. We've just implemented a new network security feature that will prevent 51% attacks. We have a tooling team that's working on signatory tools and wallets and other more user-oriented features that will make it easier to use the blockchain and have complete control over your assets. And then we have our accelerator, where we give grant funding, we provide investment and support to early stage blockchain projects that are looking to build um, either on top of Ethereum Classic or Ethereum, or address large universal problems in blockchain. Um, One example is Prescripto, which is project that's using blockchain to increase access to healthcare. Another is Pingme, that's providing microloans primarily in East Africa. Um, these are early stage projects. They're promising projects, and they're using the technology in a way that we think is innovative and sustainable.
Can you say a little bit more about this application for healthcare? Like, what is it that these people who are building that application are um, sort of doing for healthcare, and who does it benefit?
Sure, it's called Prescripto. They're primarily based in Latin America. And what they do is make it easier for people to access and keep a record of their medical prescriptions, which is difficult in any environment. And in some ways, it's a good use for the blockchain because of the supply chain characteristics, um, and also because of the record keeping that it allows. Uh, and this is something that we think will solve a fundamental problem, and is solving a fundamental problem. It's an interesting project. They were recently given an award by Newsweek as a promising startup. We were introduced to them through our partnership with UNICEF Innovation, where they went through the UNICEF Innovation Incubator, and we provided follow-on funding. We think it's a good project, and we're happy to be working with them.
And then, yeah, I mean, like, it's great to hear that people are actually building real live products for things that have, at least within the space, have always been a buzzword for, a killer use case, right? Medical records, or in this case, right, records of one's prescriptions and such. So it's great to hear that people, whatever chain they're sort of building on, but especially in this case for Ethereum Classics, right? It's great to hear that people are actually trying to, get this idea of, supply chain and identity records on an immutable ledger. You had also mentioned that people in East Africa were making use of, lending and borrowing applications, right? This sort of gets me thinking about DeFi, right? Where sort of blockchains and the integration of smart contracts on blockchains are being used to allow a more inclusive group of people to take part in the the traditional aspects of banking, like lending and borrowing. But maybe before we get into a more philosophical discussion about sort of right, making that open to certain people who may not have before been in a position to access it, maybe you can say for now what ETC blockchain is doing for DeFi. Is there anything going on there? Are people trying to sort of build out a DeFi space? Is there any kind of DAI ETC in the works?
There very much is. You must have heard a rumor or something. In fact, later this week, we'll be announcing a new bridge between Ethereum Classic and MakerDAI that will allow people who hold ETC to access DAI for the first time. And this will be really the gateway for the connection between ETC and other DeFi platforms that we've been working on for some time. Both, self-listing platforms, as well as platforms that have an application process and require some kind of community participation. So we think that there's a large demand from the Ethereum Classic community to be able to participate in DeFi. We also think that given our social impact mission, there's a really important role for DeFi to play in how Ethereum Classic is used.
And what sort of competitive edge do you think the ETC chain has over, any one of its competitors like Ethereum, which, now just as a matter of fact is kind of the sort of hotbed for a lot of decentralized finance applications, or even Tezos or sort of Cardano, these sort of next in line chains. I mean, what does ETC, Ethereum Classic, what does the Ethereum Classic blockchain have as a competitive edge over other competing protocols?
Yeah, I don't see competition in that way. I think the technology is way too early to be competing with one another. If you're worried about competing, you're going to end up being isolated. It stifles innovation. We need in this ecosystem greater collaboration. We need more idea sharing across communities, because many of the blockchains have the same challenges, and it's unlikely that we're going to solve them all by ourselves. So just as a general rule, I think it's a mistake to think of competition between blockchains in that kind of stereotypical way. In terms of what makes Ethereum Classic distinct with DeFi is, I think in terms of mission, we're very focused on emerging markets and developing countries. We're very focused on applying blockchains in areas where you have large numbers of people who've traditionally been excluded from the financial system, people who typically operate in informal economies, and making that digital. In practical terms, Ethereum Classic has low gas fees, so your transaction costs are very low. It has higher TPS, so they tend to be quicker. And, it doesn't have the same amount of congestion as some other chains do. So, there are definitely advantages. Now, the disadvantage is that, there's not as much liquidity on Ethereum Classic as there are in some other chains. So, of course, there's trade-offs, but we think that over time that will change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer to my question, because, in a lot of ways, I regret the way that I framed it, because as you went on to say, it's not, and this is one thing that I agree with you on. I mean, there are others, but at least on this point, that it's
glad we agree.
that it's not necessarily to sort of frame it as, what sort of, competitive edge does it have, right? When I asked that question, I meant to say, what is ETC blockchain doing to, I guess, have a cooperative edge, if you will, right? And sort of you went on to answer the question in a very elegant way, saying that, well, it's not necessarily about, competing, because we're still, right, if we take the analogy of where the internet was in the early 90s when I was just a kid, right, this is essentially where we're at with blockchain and encrypted digital currencies and that whole world. So I think you're right to say that it's not necessarily about competing in the sense of one sort of chain to rule them all, right? So really, it was about asking, what does Ethereum Classic have to offer by way of, working in a world of interoperable chains. And I appreciate that you answered the way that you did, because it sort of makes it clear that It's not necessarily about Ethereum Classic taking over all, right? But it's what can it do in its sort of carved out niche to provide whatever it has to provide for the people that want to make use of it. Now, on that note, I want to ask you what what do you think is one thing that ETC is going to, I guess, provide for people that may be interested in your accelerator program, right? I guess to concretize my question there a little bit, what sort of uh, uh, sandboxes are you providing people that may not be familiar with the protocol at a deep level, but who may be interested in building on top of it?
Sure. So the funding and support that we provide through the accelerator is focused on a number of thematic areas. One is decentralized storage. We think that this is going to be an increasingly important area for blockchain as its adoption grows. And there are some interesting projects out there that we've partnered with, like Swarm, and we think there's room for more. Another area is around network security. Personally, I think that this is an area that it needs a lot more innovation and thought. Simply relying on the idea that if you have enough hash rate, your network is secure isn't good enough. And I think we need to encourage more innovation there. Another area is around use cases in emerging markets, as I mentioned. And there we're looking at mission-driven projects where you have transactions with high social value. So it's not about trading. It's not really about the token. It's about information that belongs on the blockchain because it needs to be easily accessed and permanent. Maybe it's health records, maybe it's land title, maybe it's something else. So I don't ever see Ethereum Classic being used for micropayments or buying a cup of coffee, for example. Please don't use blockchain for that. At least not yet. Where I see Ethereum Classic playing a role as a proof of work Ethereum-based chain is really, as I mentioned, in emerging markets and developing countries for transactions that have high social value.
Great. I mean, like, just if you will allow me to get fixated on one thing that you were saying there, you mentioned not using blockchain-based assets to, pay for coffee. I mean, what do you think it's going to take for us to use it with that kind of ease and accessibility?
I think it's going to take technical innovation to make it as quick or quicker than current systems. I mean, MasterCard, they've got incredible TPS. It's going to be a while before blockchain can match that. I think also it's going to take more diversity in blockchain. So right now you have tokens that are a commodity, maybe a utility token, maybe a payment system. And I think over time, you'll start to see tokens and chains develop with a single use. So you'll see, I believe, a payment token, and that's all to be used for. Or you'll see a token that's really a commodity and used as a tradable asset, like you would with a corn future or something like that. Those use cases will evolve, but at the moment they're kind of bundled all together. And so, when you look at the value of, say, a particular token like a Bitcoin, you're much better off holding that to see if it appreciates in value than you are spending it here and there on a cup of coffee your transaction costs and maybe a capital gains tax are going to cost way more than that cup of coffee did. It just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, do you think that there is any difference between I guess, the sort of consensus mechanisms that are utilized by different blockchains? Do you think that there's any difference between, proof of work and proof of stake for this very issue? Do you think that layer 2 solutions are going to be kind of our answer to this question where, maybe at the end of the day, we want all of our transactions for whatever reason to be, immutable and stored on the blockchain. But because we acknowledge, as you're mentioning here, it may not be scalable at this time. How do you feel about those innovations at this point?
Oh, I think they're great and fascinating. There's fundamental differences between proof of stake and proof of work. I think proof of stake offers higher transaction speed. I think it gets closer to being able to have systems that allow you to conduct micropayments and do other transactions more quickly. And there's also different security assumptions. So, your risk of 51% attack, for example, goes away. There's different security risks, but they're, maybe more easily managed. I'm not sure, but it's a different set of security assumptions that you're dealing with.
Sure. Great. Thank you. We're starting to kind of, I guess, approaching the last 10, 15 minutes here. So I want to kind of shift into some more thematic questions, but they're still very much related to blockchain and cryptocurrencies and what we've been talking about. You had just mentioned 51% attack. That can be a quite scary thing for a blockchain protocol. So maybe couching it in terms of sort of things that are scary or spooky for this space, right? Can you say a little bit more about one, what a 51% attack is, and two, why it's a scary thing? That is, why is it a threat to a blockchain? What is the significance of an attack of that proportion?
Yeah, so as you probably know, Halloween came early to Ethereum Classic this year. We had 351% attacks between the end of July and the end of August. Definitely a scary time. So basically, in a 51% attack, what happens is someone is able to collect more than 51% of the hash power that's needed to verify and publish blocks. And what this means is that they can go and create essentially counterfeit transactions. And they can then take those counterfeit transactions to an exchange, present the tokens that they've minted, and exchange them for others that they can then go out and trade or redeem. It's interesting, the 51% attack is both something that's within the limits of the system as it was designed and extremely dangerous. The consensus rules are such that if someone is able to gain 51% of the network, well, then they've operated within the rules of the system. The danger comes because you have these gateways between the fiat world and the crypto world, such as exchanges, where those transactions can be presented as legitimate when they're not. And so what happens is, in a 51% attack, miners lose their block rewards. So they thought they've had income, and it turns out they don't have income, so they've lost money. And exchange customers basically have funds stolen. Now, exchanges, for the most part, will reimburse the accounts that get stolen, so customers don't actually feel the loss. But it's actually people's money that gets stolen from a 51% attack, and this is where it's dangerous.
Yeah, good. Um, on another scary note, aside from the security of a system internally, um, blockchains can be very scary for systems externally in the sense of it being a challenge to current extant systems like, you know, central banking, or the way that governments are in cahoots with um, financial workings and in charge of economic decisions, etc. Right? Like, for example, in the United States, uh, the sort of U.S. government sort of can communicate with the Federal Reserve, and they can increase the rate of inflation at unprecedented rates, um, such that people in the long term are, not really able to, their incomes aren't able to keep up with that rate of inflation, and it does a lot of sort of weird and subtle harm in the long term. On that point of it being sort of blockchains in themselves being sort of scary or sort of challenging to extant systems, what do you, in your opinion, think is the sort of number one, um, I guess, what is the biggest potential that blockchain has to challenge such infrastructures, insofar as those infrastructures need to be challenged?
Permissionlessness. Permissionlessness is, the nightmare on K Street. It's, it's something that I think centralized systems don't readily understand. And if they do understand them, it's terrifying. The idea that, peer-to-peer transactions will marginalize centralized control, that sovereign nations could possibly no longer be able to track transactions or tax transactions or exclude certain transactions. This is actually, I think, it's a revolutionary idea, and I think actually one of the most fragile ideas in blockchain. I think it's one of the things that's most at risk as blockchain grows.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. As we were talking about earlier, one of the things that I try to explain to my friends and family who may not be as privy to the technical aspects of this space, right? Because let's be honest, it can seem like there's quite an intimidating wall that is erected between those people who purport to know what's going on here and those who are completely not in the know. So one thing that I try to explain to people that are on the other side of that wall is that it's not just about technology, right? It's actually about um, sort of liberating human beings on a global scale, right? It's about liberating human beings in the age of the internet through reworking these sort of systems on which their money lives, right? Why is that important? Well, it's because money is essentially fuel for driving economic activity, right? And if you have open and permissionless, right, this was the start of your answer. If you have open and permissionless um, sort of systems where people are free to not only make transactions, right, at will by owning their sort of, private keys or the sort of passwords to their bank accounts, if you will, but by being able to make decisions in virtue of where they put their money, right? Because protocols are sets of rules, right? They are sort of where, like, putting your money into a blockchain is a way of voting for a kind of governance model, right?
Mhm.
And so it's so coming back to this point about what I try to communicate, of course, in different terms to people that I know that are on the other side of that technological wall. I try to say, well, look, it's the same money that you've known your whole life, right? But but it's a way of encrypting money and storing money on the internet that allows you to sort of preserve democratic ideals that we value. Yeah. And so I think it's great when we have not only an entire space, right, an entire cryptocurrency market that is doing that, but when we have, right, organizations like ETC Labs that are really upholding those kinds of ideas. So the last thing that I want to ask you here, sort of on a somewhat philosophical note, akin to what I was just going on about, is for those people who are still unfamiliar with or perhaps skeptical about the potential of cryptocurrencies and immutable ledgers and blockchains and all those other buzzwords. For those people that are still skeptical or unfamiliar with the potential that this all has on a better future, what do you have to say? How can people get involved, and why should they care?
Uh, they should care because this is a transformational technology. And in order for it to uh, provide the social and economic benefits that it promises, um, it needs to get greater adoption. History is littered with good ideas that went nowhere because, uh, they weren't accepted, they weren't adopted. And here's one that I think can really improve our systems. It can improve people's lives. Uh, and if it's there, why not use it? So I think people should definitely pay attention and learn about it. How to get involved? Blockchains are really community driven. They are essentially community organizations. So I think it's actually very easy to become part of a community. At Ethereum Classic, we welcome you with open arms. Go to etclabs.org. You can send me an email, terry.c@etclabs.org. And, we have mentoring opportunities. We have events normally. And there are other communities like Ethereum that are extremely active all around the world. Uh, and becoming part of that community, you learn from your peers and from other people. There's no real textbook. Um, there's no real how-to. It's really a social network that you become part of and pursue your interest.
Yep. And, one thing I would add on to that is, you know, if you get a little bit of skin in the game, then you all of a sudden have motivation to sort of explore the paths that Terry was just laying out. You got to get some skin in the game, people. Terry, you know, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to get on this call with me and share a little bit about what ETC Labs is, what y'all are doing. Um, Definitely, we will need to get y'all on another workshop here at MouseBelt University, because I definitely know people appreciate that and they love to hear about all of the opportunities that are available to them for helping build out this space. Um, Everyone, where can Terry, where can people go to learn more about ETC Labs? Like, tell us social media handles, website. What do you got?
Website, etclabs.org. You could go to our GitHub where we have all of our open source code at ETC Labs core. We also have Twitter, Ethereum Classic Labs. So check us out, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Right on. Well, thanks again, Terry. Everyone tuning in, this is Reimagine 2020, our fourth version, Tales from the Crypto. Stay tuned and take care.
Thanks, Tyler.